Good morning and welcome to this year's end of year regulatory update. Slides working properly. There we go. My name is Tad Berger. I am the director of the Environmental Due Diligence and Remediation Group here at Pynchon. Pynchon, as most of you probably know, is a international company both in Canada and US. Been operating since 1981, providing a full range of environmental services across Canada and through large sections of the US. Today, what I'm going to talk about is the regulations, the BC regulations that they relate to contaminated sites, and focusing on what's changed in the last few years, what's stayed the same but is quite important and not always well understood. And I'll get a little bit into what I think will be changing in the coming year or so. As a general speaking, there haven't been any major changes to the regulations. We haven't had a staged amendment in 2024. The last one was in 2023, a stage 14 update. But there have been a few changes to protocols. There have been a number of changes to the ministry's website, and thus their guidances. And so a few things have shifted in the way the policy is being moved through the Ministry of Environment. Most of that earlier in the year, as with the election, the Ministry of Environment has been hesitant to make any kinds of policy changes until the new government has had a chance to sit and provide them some direction as to how the new Minister of Environment is looking for things to move. So what we've got here on the screen are some common triggers, things that tend to bring a site into the purview of a Ministry of Environment. And I've got slides on each of these, but I'm going to go briefly through what they are. So the first is we have municipal permits. Anytime there's any kind of rezoning, building permits, development permits, or similar types of permits, your property has the potential of coming into the purview of a Ministry of Environment and various regulatory triggers being set off, which can significantly delay or even inhibit the ability for your project to move forward, adding to both timelines and costs to any kind of project that requires any of these sorts of permits, even for quite simple sites often. If you have activities that are certain activities, and I'll go through what the list is, that stop operating on a site, those as well can result in the Ministry of Environment requiring information to be provided to them and investigations to be conducted at sites. If you're removing contaminated soil from a site, there are triggers and requirements to notify the ministry related to that and to manage that soil properly. In some cases, removal of clean soil from a site can also trigger requirements and notifications to the Ministry of Environment. If you are importing clean soil to a site, it probably doesn't immediately trigger a Ministry of Environment review, but it is something that has potential future consequences to a site and therefore needs to be done with proper due diligence and care. When an adjacent property is contaminated your property, there are impacts of that, which I will talk to further later in the presentation. And finally, if you have any kind of spill on your site, that would require proper notification to the ministry as well as proper mitigation measures in order to address and clean that up. So let's move into the municipal permits. So the first is your site. First thing that often happens is a site disclosure statement. And this is essentially a short form that the Ministry of Environment requires, and the municipality will ask you to fill out a site disclosure statement to submit when you apply for one of your permits. It is really important that a site disclosure statement get filled out correctly. I've seen a number of instances where a responsible party has filled out a site disclosure statement, misunderstanding some of the questions and has filled it out wrong, and in doing so has pulled their property into a regulatory process that that property did not need to go through. And it's really, really difficult to get that property back out of that regulatory process once it has been pulled in. It's not impossible, but it is very, very difficult. And the regulatory process can end up costing hundreds of thousands of dollars if you're required to go through it, and cause months and months and months of processing delays. So having an environmental consultant who's done ideally a phase one on a property is ideal to help you to put together that site disclosure statement so that it is correct and accurate, and does not pull your property unduly into the regulations. It also will allow that consultant to provide you guidance of when an exemption applies regarding the site disclosure statement, so that if a municipality insists on one, even if the ministry exemption applies, that exemption can be placed right onto the site disclosure statement, and that will, if that site disclosure statement then gets forwarded to the Ministry of Environment, it will, the Ministry of Environment will know that an exemption applies, and they won't process it and won't put what we call a regulatory freeze on the process. And why do we call it a regulatory freeze? It's regulatory freeze because if the site disclosure statement lists any Schedule 2 activities on a property, the Ministry of Environment will automatically tell the municipality that they may not issue any permits for the property related to that site disclosure statement. And that will freeze the municipality's ability to move forward. It's comes out of the municipality's control. It is in the Ministry of Environment's control and purview, and you need to get a release of that freeze in order to move your project forward. And so there are a number of different freeze releases, and I've got them bullet pointed here on the screen. The first is something we call a Scenario 1 freeze release. That is more or less asking, please release the freeze. It does not necessarily require any kind of investigation to be done beforehand. It's only can be used when there are future permits that are going to be required, and there are a number of other stipulations that the ministry lists on their website as to when a Scenario 1 release is allowed. It's a fairly simple thing to apply for, but it still takes the Ministry of Environment several months, often towards 3 or 4 months, or sometimes even longer, in order to process the Scenario 1 release, as it's not one of their, I don't believe it's one of their higher priority items. They look towards approving, processing certificates of compliance as a higher priority to the freeze releases. And that is, I believe, because the Ministry of Environment would prefer sites get approvals and principles or certificates of compliance instead of freeze releases, and therefore they prioritize their preferred closure methods. The Scenario 3 freeze release is much more difficult to get. It requires a full range of investigations into site. It requires development of a remedial plan. And in most cases, if you were looking at a Scenario 3 freeze release, you probably should be looking at an approval in principle. There are some instances where there are various nuances where the approval in principle simply isn't a viable option, and so the Scenario 3 release exists, but it's not the preferred option in most cases under the current regime. In the past, it has been a very, very favorable option, but under the current processes, it's currently being discouraged by the ministry and the way they set up their policy. The fourth bullet here is the other freeze release. That is a newer freeze release that the ministry has clarified on, which allows you to, which allows them to release a property, and it's been really developed to create an option for where situations they haven't thought of, where a freeze release might be appropriate. In order to get that release, you still need to jump through a number of hoops as far as doing an appropriate level of investigation. You need to convince the Ministry of Environment that there is no harm or likely harm that will be caused by allowing that release to occur. And if they can be convinced of that, they will issue a release. That's been created because there have been a number of instances where none of the other release mechanisms really worked for the site properly, and the ministry saw that they needed to have a catch-all that they could use. But again, they need to be convinced that is the appropriate area to go with. Now, the approval in principle, this is one that has seen a real rebirth in the last several years with ministry policy changes. And we're seeing a lot more of these. And these are very, very useful release. They release all permits, and they are essentially a permanent release, as opposed to the others, which are temporary releases of only the permits you requested, with any future permits getting frozen and needing to be released. Approval in principle releases all the permits. It is a certification, what the ministry refers to as a certification document, what we used to call a legal instrument, but the ministry has moved away from that terminology. The approval in principle says that you've investigated sites, you understand the conditions, you have understand delineation, you've developed a remedial plan, and you contractually promise to implement that remedial plan over a period of time, often during the construction phase of a project, and the ministry will accept that, usually with the stipulation that you need to provide annual reports that indicate that you are in fact moving forward on that remedial plan, and that remedial plan is moving towards likely success of being able to get a certificate of compliance. If you do not follow that remedial plan, then the ministry has the option to issue an order to force you to follow your remedial plan that you indicated that you would in fact follow. With this approval in principle, once you've completed, once a site meets the ability to get a certificate of compliance, you don't technically have to get a certificate of compliance, but the paperwork that you need to supply to the ministry to close out that the annual reporting requirements of approval in principle and the fees associated with providing that to the Ministry of Environment, you might as well get a certificate of compliance. I think it's actually cheaper to get the certificate of compliance at that point, and it provides you a better closure than a closed out approval in principle. As the certificate of compliance is a statement of the site was contaminated and the site is now either remediated or sufficiently remediated with risk controls under a risk assessment, and that no further action should be required. With the caveat that under some risk assessments, there may be long-term monitoring or other types of monitoring that are required to demonstrate that the risk controls remain valid and successful. The final determination, which is the golden one of all of these, is essentially a statement of the site was never contaminated, isn't contaminated, and is a closure. And it's obviously the best one to get for a site if you can, but the data determines whether or not you are getting a final determination or certificate of compliance. You can only get a final determination if the site was never contaminated. If there was contamination, it was remediated or risk managed, then you need a certificate of compliance. All of those go through various process, the approval in principle and the certificate of compliance. Timelines, the ministry's official statement is 1 to 18 months. I have been seeing them recently in the 2 to 3 month processing window. That seemed to be what the ministry is doing, but I would warn that 1 to 18 month statement from ministry is given for good reason. You don't want to bank on being able to have your certificate of compliance in hand in 3 months. Things sometimes can take longer, and as a consultant, we have very little control over the Ministry of Environment's timelines. I will note that the Ministry of Environment is expediting and sites that have residential developments associated with it. They have indicated that they are putting those to the front of the list without slowing down the non-residential ones, but honestly, I don't know how you speed one thing up without slowing something else down, unless you bring in a whole bunch of additional resources to do that. So they're trying not to slow down the non-residential, but they're definitely indicated that they are speeding up the residential ones, at least a little bit, or at least prioritizing them. Note that for some sites that are high-risk sites, some of these options are not available. For instance, scenario 3 release is really, really difficult, and I don't think it's even an option for the high-risk sites. And they tend to be a lot more expensive to get. In a high-risk site, you've got significant contamination, and you're going likely to ministry review and a direct to ministry versus a through CSAP review on a non-high-risk site. The approval in principle and certificate of compliance timelines are much more likely in the 6 to 9 month review timelines as opposed to the 2 or 3 month timelines. But can still move forward on a high-risk site. Noting also a high-risk site will automatically require regular reporting to the ministry regarding the conditions and how those high-risk conditions are being addressed so that no harm is happening to any individuals. So what brings things into regulations? The things that bring things into regulations is if there's a Schedule 2 activity, and that's Schedule 2 of a Contaminated Sites Regulation. And I've got here a list of a number of the key Schedule 2 activities that are quite common. This is by no means exhaustive. I recommend you go to Schedule 2 of a CSR, Contaminated Site Regulations, take a look at the full list. It is several pages long. But on it, most heavy industries are on there. Metalworking and welding shops are on there. Now, welding shops, metalwork, there is a line where it's not considered Schedule 2 versus is. So for instance, if you've got a warehouse and there is a welding station that gets used, every couple of months, somebody welds one thing, that's probably not a welding shop. And I would not think that that would be considered a Schedule 2 activity. Whereas if that same warehouse, there's a guy whose full-time job it is to do welding, and he's constantly welding things, that's more likely to be a welding shop. And the Ministry of Environment's not provided very clear definitions of when something is or is not. And so there is unfortunately a gray zone as to, well, if somebody's there and they weld twice a month, is that? How about if they weld 4 times a month? There's not a clear definition as to when it is or isn't, and it's allowed for the professional judgment to try and make that decision, with the note that the Minister of Environment can yell at you later to say that you were mistaken in your definition and you should have classified something, but it wasn't. And so that can be problematic, but it hasn't reared its head too many times that I'm aware of at this point. Appliance repair, medical laboratories, that one surprises a lot of people. It's actually chemical, radiological, or medical laboratories. So that means that if you've got a building that has or has had, because Schedule 2 activities, if it was ever on the property, ever, then that Schedule 2 designation stays with the property throughout time immemorial. So forever. So if there had historically or is currently a building that had a medical laboratory that did blood and urine samples on the 3rd floor of that building and that entire property are classified as Schedule 2, and all the regulatory issues related to that qualify for that. I have had to do quite a number of hospital assessments because of the laboratories in the hospitals, even though those are sometimes the only areas of concern, and trying to figure out what chemicals to analyze from a medical laboratory that does blood and urine samples is it's a bit of a challenge, as they don't use a lot of chemicals that are regulated there. Road salt storage. Now that's, so road salt storage can be an area of concern. Again, very small quantities aren't, but large quantities would be, and where that designation falls is a matter of judgment. Dry cleaners for sure. They almost always cause contamination. Commercial fuel storage, RFOs, that's what we call retail fuel outlets. Vehicle repair and maintenance. Marinas surprise people a lot of times. So you've got your boat marina. It doesn't necessarily have to have boat repair happening. Just the boat marina itself is a Schedule 2. Any kind of waste disposal, municipal yards, municipal snow storage. Now that's only municipal snow storage. So if you've got a commercial property, large parking lot, and you've got snow storage there, that's not Schedule 2. But if you are leasing part of your land to allow the municipality to dump their snow on it, that would be municipal snow storage. And that's a concern because of all the salt it brings, all the metals and all the other stuff it's scooped up from a road that it's bringing over to the site. And then pulp mills, wood treatment are other common Schedule 2 activities. So another one of the changes that came in effect. This regulation came in effect February 1st, 2021. And it's related to the ceasing of operations of facilities. So if you have any of those activities on Schedule 2 and on a property and they stopped operating, and they become officially to have ceased operation 12 months after they stopped operating. Okay, so you have a dry cleaner and it leaves the property, and 12 months later, that dry cleaner is officially considered to have ceased operation. When the last Schedule 2 activity ceases operation, then you've got a trigger if it's occurred. Okay, so if you've got a dry cleaner and it closes and another dry cleaner opens 6 months later, you haven't had 12 months, it's not ceased. If you've got a dry cleaner and a gas station on property and the dry cleaner closed and the gas station is still running, the dry cleaner is not the last Schedule 2 activity, and so this doesn't trigger. But if that dry cleaner or gas station then leave, and there's no other Schedule 2 activity and no new Schedule 2 activity comes in within that 12 months, then the operation is ceased. Even if on month 13, a new Schedule 2 occurs, it doesn't matter if a trigger has occurred and there are requirements. 6 months after the cessation of activities, so essentially 18 months after that Schedule 2 is left, there is a requirement to submit a site disclosure statement to the Ministry of Environment. And the reason for that is it puts into the Ministry of Environment's record something that says that there was a Schedule 2 activity on this property. That way, it doesn't get forgotten to time. That there had been a dry cleaner, it operated for 2 years, it closed, it went away, everybody forgot about it, and treated it properly like there was never a Schedule 2. Ministry doesn't want that to happen. Therefore, they required within 18 months of that dry cleaner close, you have to notify them. That puts it on the site registry. That memorializes it forever. Anybody doing a phase 1, stage 1 is going to pull the ministry's database, and they're going to see that, okay, there was Schedule 2 activities on this property that have requirements. 12 months after you submit that site disclosure statement, you need to submit a risk classification. And the ministry stipulated that in order to do that risk classification, you have to do a stage 2 or a phase 2 level investigation. So if you've got that property and on February 2nd, that medical lab in the 3rd floor closes and gets replaced by another doctor's office, 6 months after 12 months, it's considered to have ceased. At 18 months, you need to submit the site disclosure statement. And then 1 year later, you need to have submitted a risk classification. So you're at 2.5 years. So essentially, you're around August of 2023, you would have had to submit. So any property that's had a Schedule 2 activity, the last Schedule 2 activity, leave between February 1st and about May 2023, if they've not submitted a site disclosure statement, at least, they are out of compliance. And I am quite certain that there are a number of properties that will find themselves out of compliance when they do their next phase 1s an assessment. I've already started catching clients with that issue. My recommendation, if you determine you're out of compliance, is to get yourself in compliance as quickly as you can. I suspect, and I can't speak for the ministry, but I suspect that if you come to them and say, hey, we realize we're 6 months out of compliance, here's all our paperwork to get in compliance, the ministry is probably just going to say thank you. They're aware that it's a new rule, and they're aware that not everybody fully understands the new rules. But I do believe that they've hired some compliance officers to help try and find that. And you want to self-identify and tell them before they identify you and send you a letter requiring compliance. You will stay much more on the ministry side if you show them that you are trying, even if you are not always compliant. It's worth knowing that even if you bought the property, you may still be obligated from a previous owner. So if property was had a dry cleaner in it, and you purchased that property in order to tear it down and redevelop, well, you probably need a certificate of compliance in that case anyway. But you purchased a property and you just change what tenants are there, and that dry cleaner, left 3 months before you purchased it. If the previous owner or dry cleaner did not do all the things that are required under this rule, as a new owner, you become a responsible party, and you would be obligated to do it, unless you can find a lawyer that tells you otherwise. And I'll note that I am not a lawyer. I'm speaking purely from my interpretation, my environmental interpretation of regulations. So this is something that's you definitely need to have an awareness of what Schedule 2 activities on your property. And if you're an owner of property that leases out to tenants, if you've got a tenant that is potentially coming in that has got Schedule 2 activities, you should think twice about whether or not you want them as a tenant, especially if there's never been a Schedule 2 activity on that property, because it will create a whole bunch of future triggers. And you probably want to put something in their lease agreement that says upon the end of their activities, they are required to complete a site disclosure statement and do all of the required investigations so that they can submit a risk classification to Ministry of Environment. That's putting that obligation onto the leaseholder as opposed to you as the property owner. So moving on to soil movement. If you've got contaminated soil, you need to characterize it. You need to submit a notice of independent remediation to the Ministry of Environment if you are moving it. Even if you're not moving it with the intent of remediating it, you're moving it because you need to move it for construction purposes, it's still remediation. Even if it's not going to fully remediate the site, it's still active remediation, and you need to tell the Ministry of Environment. And you need to make sure that that soil is going to a facility that is permitted to take that contaminated soil so that it's properly managed and treated. And there are a number of places in BC that will clean and reprocess so it can reuse soil. So not all contaminated soil necessarily has to go to landfill and fill up our landfills. There are a number of greener and sustainable options that can be considered, often depending on which contaminants and where your property is within the province. If you're moving clean soil, you should always characterize it, because you need to know not all clean soil is clean. You might have a property, it's residential or it's greenfield and it's never had anything built on it, and there's no reason for there to be contamination. That doesn't mean that there's not naturally occurring metals, especially arsenic and iron, that are above the regulatory standard. And while that soil is considered clean because it meets natural background conditions on your property, the moment you dig it up and put it in the back of a truck, you're moving it somewhere else, so it's not natural to where you're disposing of it. So if you just bring it down the road to somebody else's property, you are contaminating their property. And that becomes a whole bunch of problems that you don't want to get into. So you need to characterize that soil before you move it, to make sure that you know that it's clean and you've designated clean, and nobody can turn around later and say, hey, you brought me a bunch of soil that was contaminated and we're suing you to recoup costs to clean us all back up now, because you've got documentation that no, it wasn't your soil. Your soil's clean. If your property had a Schedule 2 activity on it and you're moving that clean soil, then the Protocol 19 comes into effect. And Protocol 19, thankfully, has been simplified recently. When it first came out early in the year, it was really problematic, and the ministry has backed off on a few of the pieces and allowed for a little bit more professional judgment to come into play. But it still requires a fair amount of investigation work to be completed. It requires notification to a public-facing database that specifies where that clean soil is going, if it's not going to a permitted facility, of course. so that it can track where this clean soil has gone from a facility. What you will find is that it's really hard to get rid of that soil because not very many places will accept clean soil from a Schedule II property. And I'll talk about why that is in my next slide. But because it's difficult to find those locations, it tends to be that you're going to have to send that soil to a permitted facility, which is important to note because it can be far more expensive. I've had conversations with clients where it's going to cost them millions of additional dollars to dispose of clean soil because they can't find a non-permitted facility that will take it, even though the soil is clean. Now, if you're bringing in soil, you need to raise your site up to above flood levels, or you want to build berms or anything, you need to make sure you know where that soil is coming from. Again, you want to make sure you're not bringing soil that's got naturally occurring metals above standard because they're considered contaminated soil when you bring it to your property. And if you bring in contaminated fill, that is a Schedule II activity. And that alone will spark all the regulatory requirements. So, somebody says, oh, yeah, it's coming from a rock quarry, so it's clean, or it's coming from property. We have a phase 1 and it was residential and there's no contamination. The consultant recommended no further investigation. That is not good enough. You need analytical data that says this soil is clean to the regulatory standards that apply at your site, and you are playing a very dangerous game if you accept soil that you do not have analytical data for. If the soil is coming from a Schedule II property, even if that soil is clean, there sparks a whole bunch of different issues. First, there's a notification requirement. There has to be a notification that goes to a publicly facing database that says that property A is taking soil and moving it to property B, and both of those properties go in a database. And that notification has to happen at least a week before the soil's moved. What I warn people about on this issue is that regulations have a tendency to change, and standards have a tendency to change, which means that if you accept soil that's clean today and the regulations change in 5 years and the standards go down, that soil might now be considered contaminated. And now you've got evidence in a publicly facing database on a ministry sites that says you've accepted soil that's above the current regulatory standards, and you are now going to have to deal with that. So it creates a whole bunch of liability and potential future liability to accept the soil, which is why I actively recommend facilities not to accept soil from a Schedule II property unless your site already had Schedule II activities, and you're already being regulated and already have stigma related to your property. In addition, there are tracking requirements regarding where that soil is actually placed. And if you accept more than 20,000 cubic meters of that soil cumulatively over forever, so you have to track how much you get each time because it becomes additive over decades even. The moment you exceed more than 20,000 cubic meters, you become a high volume site. You need to register with the Ministry of Environment. You need to install groundwater wells. You need to do reporting. You need to do a whole bunch of stuff. You're looking at tens, possibly hundreds of thousands of dollars of additional work you need to do over multiple years in order to be a high volume site. And so you probably want to avoid doing that unless there's really good reason to become that, especially when you can take soil not from a Schedule II activity and none of these things trigger. Okay, with regard to contaminant migration, the source parcel has obligations to notify the impacted party. So if there is identification that contamination has migrated or has likely migrated, and the word likely is not well defined by the ministry. So again, there's a lot of professional judgment in that terminology. But if you know that it has migrated, is likely migrated, you need to notify the offsite party. And there's actually a 15-day clock from when you become aware of that to provide that notification. And you also provide that same notification to the Ministry of Environment, so it becomes aware of both source parcel and the affected parcel. And the source parcel is obligated to address and remediate and manage the contamination on that offsite property. They are the responsible persons. Now, there's not timelines per se as to how quickly they address that, especially if it's not a high risk condition. So it might not be that the affected party might not be happy with the speed in which that remedial work is happening. If you are the affected party and you're not happy with the speed things are going, I strongly recommend you talk to a lawyer and get legal advice, because as the impacted party, you still have obligations with regards to protecting your people, your workers, your tenants. And if you are looking to redevelop your property, you still have obligations to manage that contamination properly. The good news there is the costs associated with that can likely be recouped through, though it requires a litigated process to do that, which again, I would suggest talking to a lawyer to see what that looks like. But it is the intent of a regulation that a affected parcel can seek compensation under the Environmental Management Act if they have costs that they incur as a result of contamination for which they are not at fault. Now, spills. There is a spill reporting regulation. It requires a notification if a spill over a specific volume occurs or if any of that spill reaches a water body. Now, and spills can happen in properties that, it doesn't just happen in your industrial facilities where you got a lot of chemical storage. I've worked on a number of shopping malls where somebody did a little bit of vandalism and tore open, thought it'd be fun to put a hole in the gas tank of a parked vehicle, and that vehicle loses, its 60 liters or more of gasoline going right into a storm drain, which is going right into a ditch. So that would be a reportable because it's going right into a ditch, which is a surface water body. So you can get those situations. I've seen a number of vehicle accidents that have also resulted in reportable spills. And so it's not only those industrial facilities that can have reportable spills. It is really anywhere that fuel in any form or chemicals in any form come on that property can have potential for a spill. You want to immediately put into place controls to stop that spill from spreading. You're probably going to want to get a vac truck out there to suck up as much of that fuel as possible, and you want to get a consultant out there to make sure that it's being cleaned properly, that the reporting is happening properly, that you're getting confirmation that it has been properly cleaned up, and noting that there are multiple reports that then trigger. There's an initial report within 24 hours to notify that the spill has occurred. But then there are various end of spill reports that are required depending on the size, nature of that spill before it gets that spill issue gets fully cleaned up. And then after that spill, there may still be remedial activities and options that are required in order to get full closure of that site. Now, what do we know is coming in the regulations? The ministry has intentionally been quite quiet on this in the last, say, 4+ months because of the interregnum period between the call of election and the new cabinet sitting. But we know from before that some of the key things that they are looking at. We know climate change and focusing regulatory issues around climate change is a key priority. The ministry, we know, are looking at requiring some additional steps within risk assessments in order to ensure that consideration has been given not just for are these risk controls working today, but will those risk controls work under various climate change scenarios? If temperatures rise, if sea levels rise, if streams go dry, will the risk controls in place continue to be effective risk controls? The ministry is looking at groundwater and groundwater protection and sharpening groundwater protection, making it increasingly difficult to eliminate the drinking water standards, making sure that they see groundwater as a future resource, a very important future resource that they feel needs a higher level of protection. And so they're really looking at places they can do that. Any opportunities for reconciliation, they do. A recent example of that is the notification requirements when you're moving clean soil. Part of a rationale for that to put it on a public-facing database that the First Nations would be able to see and know what soil movement is occurring within their traditional lands, so that they can be aware, and they can. I don't think there's much that they can do per se under the current, but I won't be surprised if that changes too. Yeah, and then we've been seeing an increased level of ministry environment review and involvement in projects. Historically, when we've submitted things to the ministry for review, especially if it's gone through a CSAP, there have been very, very few questions. It's clear that the ministry is reading the documents a lot closer in the last couple of years and seem to be trending more and more in that direction, asking questions and looking for additional input. In all, I don't see that being a bad thing. It's showing that they expect a high level of product, which we're happy to provide. Unfortunately, it does not come with greater access to the ministry. For instance, you can set a meeting with the ministry to talk about a site, though they won't talk about a site that's in for review with a meeting, but you can have a meeting with them, but the people you're meeting with aren't necessarily the final decision makers, and you cannot come out to any kind of conclusive statements at those meetings. They start the meetings by expressing that all their decisions are subject to review and change when they see the final reports. So you can get some consensus, and I've had some very valuable meetings where we got some good consensus, and been able to explain an approach to the ministry so that things can move forward. But it's the level of access is not where I would hope it would be. With working with the ministry, especially as a CSAP, I would hope to see a higher level of access than what we currently have. Though I think that there might be a slow movement in that direction, and so I'm heartened to see some of that, and hope to see that we continue to see more ministry collaboration earlier in projects, and the allowance for that. And finally, I'm going to give a little bit my one shameless plug for Pension and our services. We really like to provide a holistic service when we are helping with a project. We provide a very wide range of services. So on a project, we can do the environmental, we can do the ecological, riparian setback, sediment erosion control, dealing with bats in the attic that need to be addressed, or birds nesting in trees that you need to take down, and invasive species management plans. We can do the asbestos assessments of a building that might be getting renovated or demolished. We can actually help with the entire demolition of a building. We've got mechanical teams. We have occupational health and safety teams. We can do the vibration and noise assessments during construction. And when you bring us in to provide a number of services holistically, our teams work together. We've set a single person to oversee all of the pieces, all the different managers and pieces, so that things don't fall between the cracks, so that we can identify issues and address issues and resolve issues that you didn't even know to think to ask for a service line to provide, because they fall in and amongst And we don't get situations where company A says, I thought company B was doing it, and company B says, I thought company A was doing it. Because if we're company A and B, we will make sure that everything in between is getting addressed and managed, because we've got our eyes on it and we've got that holistic sense to be able to address it. And so we really prefer those opportunities, because we can provide a better value added service, which is really makes it a lot more fun and enjoyable for us to do that work when we're really providing a lot of value. It's more meaningful work, and that's what we love, is that meaningful work. And so I will open it up to any questions. If you got any questions, you can put them in the question and answer, and I will attempt to answer them.